Well, you know, as I moved last year, our loss rate year to date through May, not closed. June is October. Maybe lost that, which I have through the first time. It's about cash projection. I've asked Mark with CFO for cash projection 13 weeks and 26 weeks. And we will be deficit, cash deficit position first or second week of October, which puts into default for payroll and for obligations and our pension in about 3 days. So the subsidy that we're projecting at this point is around $7 million from the county to remain solvent through the end. So
Okay, when would that have to be paid over?
well,
And how do you want it paid?
I think from like an installment, probably the 7 million, 2 million, 2 million, 3 million, or something to that effect. The big question that we have, Mark and I, is how fast we can make changes. And that's the challenge. Anytime you work in a distressed hospital or health system, it's a big operation. It's like an ocean liner. It doesn't turn quickly. A lot of the contracts that we're looking at, the minimum term employment or notice is 180 days, that's 6 months. So even if we were to start changing contracts now, we wouldn't be able to get out of them until first part of next year. Recruiting positions can sometimes take 6 months, they can sometimes take more. We've been we're aggressively looking at our surgeons. We have an opportunity with a gastroenterologist from Buffalo, who's the attorney at the VA. He's interested in coming potentially a few days a month to help us with GI. Just met with an orthopedic surgeon who's now working with us. He's interested in covering for about 2 weeks a month. So we'll be presenting these two folks next month for us to contract with these folks and get them in here as soon as possible. So that we can job surgeons, neurologists, so forth and so on. So we're aggressively recruiting. There's a number of cost initiatives that the list is now well over 50 items that we're looking to process. A lot of the work though is just the limitations are just there's only a few of us kind of with the experience and knowledge to handle all of these changes. So it's going to take a while. So Doug, to your point, that's the subsidy for the end of the year, I guess, in January. We're most likely at this point looking at 2023 with a subsidy of anywhere from 8 to 12 million, again, depending on our process and closing the deficit.
Mr. Kobus,
Sure.
how much has the county provided to the hospital in terms of subsidy year to date?
Which is a good thing Janice is sitting next to me. I believe it's there's maybe $2 or $3 million year to date. Is that correct?
Just over 3.
So inclusive of the 7, we're talking 10 million for the entire year.
That's the projection.
So just to put that into perspective, typically we carry a fund balance of 15 million, just so you know. We have, of course, more than that because of the ARPA funds. So let's just throw this out there. And they need 7 million on top of the 3. 3's budgeted, we raised taxes, 7, we did it. If they need, give me that number for 2023.
Anywhere from 8 to 12.
12 million, let's just say 12. plus 7 is more than what we ever carry in fund balance, according to our fund balance policy. I'm just throwing that out there for perspective.
Understood.
But there's 3 million in the budget for next year, potentially. But the same, we do the same next year, we did this year, 3 million.
I put 3 as a projected amount.
Still,
Your cash projection included or did not include IGT funding?
It did, because the one we showed you 2 weeks ago.
And I wasn't sure if that included it or not, because how would you know? Trying to remember.
I don't know, there were some projections in there, but it's a ballpark. It could be a little bit less, could be a little more, but just for some context, we just to start with the auditor, we're completing their audit 2021. And the loss for last year, operating margin, was about 4 plus, give or take. And I asked her the question, the auditor, if you take out supplemental funds from the state, from the federal government, what was the true operating loss? And it's about 5 million in supplemental funding from last year. So the operating loss last year was closer to $9 or $10 million from the hospital. Just to put that in context. And if you throw the $8 million in agency costs that we're now spending, we weren't spending last year, that gets us almost $18 million. So it's not going from 4 to 20. Quite frankly, there's other supplemental funding from last year, plus this agency. Does this make sense? The agency nursing really didn't kick in until this year. This is the 80 million that we're projected to spend. They have nurses cover the hospital.
What would we normally spend in,
Agency,
yes,
historically less than $500,000.
and now
That's
we're,
true with most hospitals.
now we're gonna spend $8.
$8 million. Yes, we're spending almost $1 million a month on agency nurses. This is why this nurse recruiter is desperately needed for us to find nurses. We're bringing them in. I actually went to orientation yesterday for the hospital, and there were 3 in the room. I almost hugged everyone, but I need more nurses.
So what was the $20 million that I unfortunately wasn't here for finance last week? What was the $20 million figure that was?
That's the projected operating loss this year, based on the results in May,
Okay,
which is $8.5 million loss. Yeah. I think it might be beneficial to do a deeper dive at next month's finance committee meeting and have Mark, right, the new CFO here, and go through this to field any questions and Janice had another question. I'm sure this group will have more. We're going to spend a lot of time at the managers meeting in 2 weeks, going through not only our operating results here today, but what our improvement plan looks like. And it's significant.
so you're already developing plans to cut those losses?
We're already implementing some changes already that you're maybe not aware of. And we've got the operating plan or the improvement plan from last year, as I understand it from Rich, was 7 or 8 items. I think I alluded to this. It's already over 50, and it'll probably be 75 or 80 items in the next month. There's a lot to do. There's opportunities, but it just takes time to process a lot of these.
And those changes would take effect in 2023 primarily?
Some of them potentially sooner. Positions that we're not going to fill, potentially restructuring some positions. Some places the hospital is overstaffed, just to put it out there. Some places the hospital is understaffed. So it's right sizing the organization.
So potentially, how much would that save? Or does the $7 million include those cuts?
The 7 million is a status quo. It continues, it assumes things continue as they are.
Okay,
So it's a worst case scenario.
all right. So if you can make further cuts in,
Yes.
what does that reflect?
Goes down.
How much?
You don't know.
Would be to explain it next finance meeting?
We can potentially, but a lot of it again is timing. Some of these changes may bleed into next year.
Well, you heard from the budget director, and I clearly got it. It's unsustainable.
Absolutely.
You know, the deficits that the hospital is running are unsustainable. We don't have enough fund balance.
Well, we would raise taxes, so
Well,
I'm sure.
yeah, of
they'll look
course,
that way,
you know.
We've got $8 million in our funds, so.
But take 40,000 residents divided into 10 million, that's $250 per man, woman, and child in this county that we're paying for the hospital. That's a chunk, you know, chunk of money.
I agree.
And like I said, I don't think it's
I'm
sustainable.
still getting acclimated to things.
Understand,
Some of these issues are
sure,
negative, right? But other ones, you know, potentially are things that the health system could have done maybe a few years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. That's water under the bridge.
And
We've got
to be
do this.
to be sure, I'm committed to allowing you an opportunity to kind of get your arms around this thing and see where we can go with it. But on the other side of the coin, you know, the taxpayers are going to, you know, foot the bill for it, and paying, you know, additional whatever the levy comes out. It doesn't sit well with a lot of folks, especially if they're not fully utilizing those services. You know, and quite frankly, we've had people who have decided they're going to go elsewhere for their health care.
You probably were at the last meeting. Our estimates now are about 16 to 7% leakage out of our service area.
Sure, sure. And we know where that came from. Okay,
Here now.
I understand. Sure, and we'll give you some time.
Here we want to talk about the resolutions. I think it was salary, we'll see. I think so.
Unfortunately, it's not the finance. We've got another one like that. So were there questions? Regarding the fact that it is not separate, that must be a finance.
How many nay votes were there?
I think it was one people for both of them,
Okay,
but not everyone's on the finance committee either. So, you have any questions? It's fine. Very nice.
I have an observation. I don't know that, this nurse recruiter. My town board brought this to me last night. Why do we need a nurse to do the nurse recruiting? And I said, you know, talk the talk. And they said, well, they didn't understand why and I honestly question it too. We're taking a nurse away from patient care and putting him in another administrative position. We should be taking all of our nurses and putting them in patient care and let our HR department that we pay almost $500,000 to take care of our nurse recruiting. I mean, and you said yourself, we had almost 50 travelers. They're going to cut it in half and now it's down to 20, I read.
Well,
So we're doing something right.
Luann, it's higher than 20.
Is it? Well, that's what I read in one of these minutes. I don't know.
It's a moving figure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It might be 23, it might be
Exactly.
25, but just my observation is I feel like, you know, we're making cuts. Every time we make a new position, we should really be thinking that through. What is a nurse recruiter going to do 8 hours a day, 5 days a week? We've got an HR department, you know, we beef that up. I don't feel very strongly about voting yes on that. Unless you know, have convincing statements for me,
So here's my convincing statement. Every day that we delay making these changes, it's going to cost the residents of Wyoming County more money. So the longer this takes to address this, what I need as the CEO is the tools and the resources to get this done. And the longer we don't have those, and we don't have those, it's a standard practice. In the hospital. The longer we don't have those, the more this is going to force that subsidy out into the future. So I agree with you. In fact, I can't disagree with what you're saying. You know, again, I'm 6 weeks here, so I don't understand how HR was structured in the past, why it doesn't have that function potentially, and it's not here, and it's away this week. To answer that question, I don't know.
I just feel like we're jumping on, and I agree, you probably need somebody dedicated to that, and whatever we've been doing seems to be working, and I know it's a lot of stress on the people that are working at the hospital now trying to accomplish that. But I just feel like our HR department should be really working on this very, very diligently, and I don't really think it needs to be a nurse. You know, we have talented HR people in the community that could probably help out doing that. We don't have doctors recruiting doctors.
No, but there also are 300 doctors in the hospital. There are 300 nurses. It's the primary job. So in the hospital, you were spot on. Nurses speak nurses to other nurses. They're able to attract networks of other nurses that they know. But nurse recruiters also recruit other positions too, clinical positions, lab, X-ray. So that clinical expertise that they have allows them to go into other areas too. So it wouldn't be exclusive to the other areas also.
Dave, do you have experience relative to the success rate of nurse recruiting in other healthcare?
I don't have
Institution.
but I can tell you that every hospital exclusively I ever worked with in 30 years has dedicated nurse recruiters, has a dedicated recruiting function, which includes nurses.
Okay,
This is the first entity I've ever been in that doesn't have a recruiting
Sure.
function.
I'm wondering why we would just simply confine the nurse recruiter to recruiting nurses and not necessarily include CNAs and other positions.
We would, and lab techs and rad techs and pharmacists and all the rest. Absolutely.
Okay,
They call them, I mean, the title is misleading, it's a nurse recruiter.
so the job duties are more inclusive.
Clinical, exactly.
All right,
Those are the hardest positions to find. Clinical.
okay.
Yeah.
I mean, Luann makes a very valid point and almost had me convinced that, you know, maybe that if we're using this individual to perform a broader function of clinical positions, it's a little bit more, I'm a little more comfortable with that.
We have challenges in the lab. We're down lab people. I know that you just don't need the radiology functions now and certain
Mhm.
techs and so forth. So yes, it's a broader responsibility.
But I do agree that that function really should be centered in the HR department. You know, that's their job and that's what you pay a considerable amount of money for. So,
I don't disagree. However, the board of supervisors would like to structure that. I just want a recruiting resource. They could be in the sheriff's department for all I care.
Sure. sure.
We just need recruiting.
But you have to have some expertise in the clinical healthcare,
Exactly.
you know, so.
So if you had a county clinical recruiter, they could help with the jail nurses, the health department nurses, any other areas that may need, people move around from department to department, out of the hospital, back into the hospital, all of that kind, maybe it'd be more cohesive to have a county recruiter, clinical recruiter, as opposed to a hospital nurse recruiter.
I'd be
I
supportive
think
of
it
that.
should definitely just be paid out of by it's 99.9% gonna be used by the hospital. If the county needed someone, I'm sure they could pick up the phone, that's how we roll in the county, we help each other out a little bit, but it really should just be a hospital. Can work with HR, but is charging back 80% of the HR department or 75, it's a lot of work to do this, and it's gonna be all pretty much for the hospital, it should just get paid out of the hospital. That's just an easier financial thought, it's mostly hospital. I think the public health has more nurses, public health nurses.
I'm just trying to keep it more globally and not all the hospital, Again, I think it should be an HR position.
I'd like to add to this a little bit. So I agree, we need to get somebody working on this. Whether it's HR, but like you said, sheriff's office. We need to get somebody working on this because what we are currently doing is not working.
But it is working.
We're gonna spend $8 million this year in agency costs. 8 million. We budgeted just over $1 million at the hospital.
Right.
So the loss in this one job set is costing everybody. We need to get somebody moving on it, we need to get somebody working on that, and that alone. They bring in 1 or 2 nurses for a year, more than pays their salary. I'm hoping for a lot more than that because we spent $8 million this year. We're on track to spend $8 million. $7 million above budget for just nurses. And what we're currently doing isn't working, so we need to get somebody, and this is one thing that David Coles has brought up to us. A nurse recruiter. And you know what? At $7 million over budget, I'm willing to look at something. It's either that or, what's our alternative? We gotta do something. And I hate to say the old adage, you gotta spend money to make money, but what we're currently doing is not working. So to second guess something like this is a bit naive in my eyes because Mr. Coles has come here with 30 years experience working on the same thing, the same mission of the stress hospital. And that's one thing he pointed out right off the bat.
Brian, I don't think, at least for myself, I don't dispute the facts, relative to the need, and how much we're spending in the cost of nurses through contract agencies. I think the question is really, how do we go about correcting that? This is one way to do that, but my fear is that, given our rural setting, we potentially could be grasping at straws, We don't know how successful we will be in our recruiting efforts. Of course, we have to try something, but I think personally it ought to be a dedicated effort within our HR department. But if we're going to get the thing kicked off and get it moving and try to address some of the deficiencies relative to personnel and the cost of those people, then let's go with it, But no disputing the facts that we need to do something.
Dave, you said you just just recently there were 3 that were there, nurses, potential hires. How did we get those?
Word of mouth primarily. Some responded to job openings and so forth. But I think it was more happenstance. it wasn't an orchestrated strategy to drive nursing. And the interesting thing is when I kick off the orientation sessions, I asked for the folks' background, where they've been working in all over the place. One was a dialysis nurse, and I had experience as a geriatrics, and this, that, and the other. But the one thing that I noted that there was maybe not an appreciation for was the differentiators that Wyoming County brings to these nurses. We can't always compete on hourly wages with Buffalo and Rochester. But the thing that really stands out is our benefit package. No match. And when I stress that to these folks, I saw a lot of heads nodding. And I'm not sure there's a real awareness or strategy to drive that. And that's something nurse recruiters, the public want. I think to get the word out. There's other benefits too. I mean, we're fair parking and it's a nice setting. You know what I mean? It's not a inner city with gunshots and car exits and all those kind of things. But just the benefit package that we're going to know is a benefit structure. But none of the hospitals in Buffalo or Rochester, but we're not promoting effect. But my sense of it is they really didn't have a good sense of that. And I explained it to them.
Dave, do we know how many people are actually graduating out of these classes?
You know, I didn't get the number off.
I know.
From Geneseo.
Okay.
I believe that there. I think 2 of them may have been recent graduates or graduates from that program. And those should be ours. We should own those. And we should have a pipeline to prevent them from going to bigger cities.
Right.
And some of these folks, interestingly enough, some of them had experience in an urban environment and they didn't like it because they were lost. Instead of a urban, we get 250 or 300 nurses. Trying to ask 5,000 nurses. And this is not, they're lost in trouble. And here there's much more of an identity. You know, the people that you're treating, you know what I mean? Again, it's a cultural fit.
I
There's
just,
a lot of folks that like it.
I was just wondering, knowing today's world, you know, a lot of them will start and then quit. They don't even start. Out of a class, how many actually graduate as a nurse? I know we don't have the number off the
It's
top
not
of
as
your
many as
head.
you would think. Yeah, it's slow, and there's a national, you know, regardless of COVID,
Right,
there was a shortage of nurses 5 years ago,
Oh, yeah.
10 years ago. It's constantly trying to catch up.
Yeah.
We probably need nationally another 500,000 nurses.
okay.
Dave, can you touch on the director of special projects for those people that weren't at finance, please?
Sure. This is a role that's to help us process all these initiatives, track them, do the analytics behind them, and keep them on task. That's really their primary function, and to help implement that. So projects, and when we have 40, 50, 60 projects, they can sometimes get lost in trouble. This person's primary responsibility is to drive that $20 million deficit in half in the next 12 months. And they will work closely with me, probably would report to me or the CFO.
What happens after 12 months?
That's just to get it in half. So we still have.
So how long do you expect that position to be around?
That's a permanent position.
Was it advertised? Just wondering.
What's it advertised?
Yeah.
I don't know.
I don't know, I may apply for that. So I'm asking.
Well, and there's a, you know, I'm the internal optimist, so we can get this fixed. You know, it's gonna take a little bit of time, and it's gonna take some, you know, change. But every rural community is going through the same thing, maybe not to the extent of ours, but they're going through the same thing. And quite frankly, looking into the future, every 18 or 36 months, organizations are going to have to change. staffed. And a position like this is a real enabler to help them manage through those projects and initiatives and improvements. Hospitals and health systems do what's known as continuous quality improvement, continuous process improvement. And notice they're always changing and adapting to technology, changes in population, migration, and all those kind of things in your service areas. So there's an always. Best performing organizations, health systems have dedicated positions like this also. Want to answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
One final question, Dave. How actively are you investigating or pursuing state and federal funding, either through pending legislation or in Albany in terms of what's available for rural hospitals?
Well, thank you for asking that, because that's another thing of this role, special projects, is to look at grant funding and other sources of supplemental funding. Because there's lots of opportunities out there, it's just aggressively going after them. The grant writing process is a specialty to do that effectively. And so, yes, we are looking at it. There's nothing definitive right now. There are some state opportunities to go after. But as you know, state funding sometimes can be a year or 2 or 3 years down the road. It doesn't, I don't think it's going to help us in the next year.
Well, I mean, the state is getting flush with sports betting tax revenue.
Right.
It's being dedicated to different things, education being one, and, we ought to have a dedicated lobbyist in Albany pushing for assistance for rural healthcare facilities, and maybe if this individual could reach out to our elected officials in Albany, at least make sure that it's on the radar. We've received funding in the past for both the state and federal, mainly through our elected officials. And so we need to continue to pursue that if we're going to be viable.
That's what it's kind of an all of the above.
The state makes more money off of sports betting than any other state.
Oh,
They
yeah.
get 50% back into the state, and the other states don't get that kind of money.
We have 2 strikes against us. I think most numbers for the kind of we're upstate, downstate, where gravity is. Republican state, but I agree with there are opportunities to say as well.
Thank you, Dave. We'll see you at finance. That's operations.
We have a presentation of streets and emergency.
Ready now.
Yeah.
There we are. That's what I love.
Test one screen.
Zero, perhaps. There you go. Manual buttons. So we're trying to figure that out. So this afternoon, we want to go over, as we previously mentioned in the past, and for those developing public safety community, we've heard from a number of months now, look at the EMS situation we're facing here in Wyoming County. So this last winter, we had a stakeholder meeting involving EMS and elected officials. Since that time, I've been working to gather information from throughout New York State, looking at different systems, looking at our model here in Wyoming County, trying to come up with what are some options that we can do to supplement the existing. So we're to that point right now where we have some proposals together. We'll go over the basis of those, give a little quick background on the current EMS situation. Then the plan for next steps going forward. So we can bring that up. With that, I can start on that. So just an overview of the current EMS system here in Wyoming County. We have 13 fire department-based ambulances, fire departments that operate ambulances. Out of that, 2 of those agencies operate 2 ambulances in Village of Arcadia and Village of Warsaw. Pike Paramedic is a paramedic level service. They went on board during COVID. So they're the advanced level, which is the same level as primarily to that paramedic level. And we have 5 agencies that fall between the basic EMT level and paramedic, or 5, hopefully in the next couple of weeks or month, with a couple of agencies that we just completed a class that are in the process of upgrading right now. We are stages waiting for that approval. We have 3 first response agencies. So those are fire departments that don't operate in the ambulance or service by fire departments. So Sheldon Harris County in Wyoming, they each run a first response model. So they run whatever apparatus from their department to that call until that ambulance from whatever fire department considers transport. 1 municipal EMS system, the town of Perry operates, then our contracted ambulance provider in the ambulance. Monroe ambulance currently run right now with 24-hour ambulance out of the hospital, then 2 additional units, the second ambulance and the paramedic flight out, which is just a paramedic and the SVP, who then ride with whatever volunteer agencies that get those support. So, next control. So our current EMS providers. So what's important to know here is we see that trend going down. That isn't just here in Wyoming County. This is throughout the country. Similar to what Mr. Colbus just said, that nursing shortage, EMS is in the same crisis as nursing is. But we see in 2005, 610 total EMS providers in Wyoming County. We see in 2022, 203 providers. Out of that kind of breaks down the levels. The biggest level that we have here are EMT levels, which is our basic EMT, which is the minimum requirement for the level of provider that can operate on ambulance. So that's CFR level. We have a number of those providers out there. Typically, you see those in those first response agencies, but they are unable to ride an ambulance without an EMT. So we have to have that EMT level. So right now, today, we have 177. I know that we do have 2 providers that their cards run out at the end of this month that will not be renewing. So that number will go down. Fortunately, you can see we are up a little bit from last year. We did have 2 successful EMT classes. One is currently testing out right now. The other one that we finished up earlier this year, we had some pretty good success rate. So that was good. We had some good attendance in those classes. We've had some very good success rate, which has brought that out. The paramedic from Pike, he used to be a critical care, which was a lower level paramedic, and through some executive orders during COVID, he was able to operate some. It's not able to run a paramedic service. Next, so looking at our call stats over a 3-year period, so that's something we really started looking at more here in the last year or 2. Is our call stats. It's on the next one. So you can see 2019, 2020, and 21 call stats. On average in the county, this factors in all of our fire calls as well. You can see we're about 5,000 calls. How these numbers, what they actually mean is this is the number of calls those agencies are dispatched to. There are times that we have 2 agencies dispatched to a call. For instance, we have a Harris Corners and Strikers going out for an EMS call. So each department's going to get one number for that call. This Harris Corners doesn't run the ambulance. So that is adding to those numbers. The one important thing to look at is we see that reduction in 2020 when COVID hit. We saw that major decline throughout the country where people were called 911, people were called hospitals. So even though we had that in the month of March and April of 2020,
Those numbers are still pretty consistent with what we've seen. And then last year, we've seen a higher call volume of 5,000 calls. Also up there, when we're running those, the call volume, they're running about 2,700 calls a year. And then our two primary commercial services are county service. Mercy EMS, that's both the Springville and Batavia operation, and then the county EMS that services the county. So those agencies are brought in when those are available, or depending on what the call is, those out of position to provide those services to the county. And then the hospital transfers, and the hospital transfers are big when we start to get into look at the numbers. You can see the decline again in COVID. Hospital transfers down over 100. That bottom line really impacts Monroe in their operation financially. Unfortunately, we are starting to see somewhat of an increase in hospital transfers. It's not to the total level that we've seen, but we are starting to see that. So when you look at that from a Monroe perspective, that's a tough balancing act for us. Obviously, we don't want Monroe taking hospital transfers to that pull that ambulance out of service from 911, but financially, Monroe needs those transfers for their operation. We'll elaborate a little bit more on that further down. So on the next slide, you'll see on our drop calls. So what these are primary unable to get a crew and drop the call. This is primarily on the EMS side. It's rare that we see that on the fire side, even though fire is struggling. It's rare we see that on the fire side, but that's just looking at anything 22 to date. Those numbers are about consistent from when we started running those in about 2019. So what you can see is through, this was middle of June that these numbers were in. For instance, our gain 313 calls today, they dropped 65 calls, which was 20.7% drop. So again, they're unable to get a crew. So that call is going to the next agency or to a Mercy or whoever else they have that call.
Brian, that's just if they're unable to get a crew, not if they're already in service.
So that doesn't account if they're already tied up on a call, it doesn't count. So say for instance, Margie was out on call, the call goes to straight to the side, it counts as a drop call. These numbers, they're not going to be 100%. I'll tell you that right now. Really what falls in place is dispatcher. Some dispatchers might not code it, some dispatchers will. So it gives you a rough number. I would never want to take these to the bank and say these are concrete numbers. They'll give you a rough idea. But we've seen that 12.9, that number has been about average since 2019 when we started on that. We're fluctuating between 9, 10, 11, 12% right in that range. Some departments are doing a lot better. Some departments aren't doing as well. Obviously, call volume is a big factor. The less calls you take, you miss a call versus higher call volume departments. So just to give you an idea, they're on the drop calls.
So that changes by personnel. I remember Strikersville almost never dropped a call. We had 2 people right there, Bert Parent and John Pickin, that never missed a call, but Bert passed away.
Absolutely, and we see that a lot.
Changes throughout the community.
Especially these departments, a lot of departments are relying on 1, 2, 3 people to take the majority of the calls. If something happens, they get sick, they get injured, they give it up, that impacts. So we see those fluctuations where this department might not do well this year. They get a new member, young blood, they're gun hole, they take all the calls. So that stuff does change. But on average, that overall county number stays about the same.
Brian, so I understand too that response times are also changing in terms of it's taking longer to get assistance to a location.
Yeah, that part of that can be the drop call. So obviously, if you don't get, that primary agency doesn't get a call, goes to another one. Our policy in Wyoming County is after 10 minutes, if that primary agency doesn't get a crew, that automatically goes to the next call. Now, the difference on the fire side is anything for the fire is automatic second company coming with them. With the EMS calls, it's that primary agency dispatched. If it is a paramedic level call, that paramedic will send automatically. So depending where that call is, say that call is going to Gainesville, one of those coming out of the hospital, they might not send the second company because one of those going to be close enough to take that call. If the call's on the other side of the county, one of those coming out of the hospital, they will dispatch a second company. So that can all throw off those stats there. And then obviously size of districts are different sizes. We have some very large districts where you take 15, 60 milligrams. There's some smaller districts. So that if you're looking at what's the average time in the county, it's really a tough one. You really have to break it down by department, how long to take down to see. So Wyoming County Certificate of Need, so the certificate of need, what that is what authorizes anyone to operate an ambulance service. So your Wyoming County Fire Department has a certificate of need from the state, where they can go out and provide an ambulance service. Wyoming County also holds a certificate of need for paramedic level services. So what that means is we're able to go out, it gives us two options. We can operate an ambulance, or we can contract that out. So we contracted that out to Monroe since the late 1990s, working under the county certificate of need. So Monroe billing, how that works, Monroe goes out, they take their call, they work with the third party billing agency, goes out, they invoice the patient. Not so much the patient, but the insurance company, whether Medicare, Medicare, whoever it might be. That third party billing company does that work, they receive the money, they give the money to Monroe. So no money comes to Wyoming County, and then goes directly to Monroe. It's a win for Monroe, it's a win for Wyoming County. We're not out any money, we don't have to do any work with it, Monroe gets whatever they're billed and how they handle collections, it's a decision to make. So it's a win-win for both. So this has come up a number of times over the years where the state has brought this to attention. According to state laws, that isn't how things can work. Whoever holds a certificate of need has to be the billing entity. So as Wyoming County holding the COI, we have to be the ones that go out and bill the patient or the insurance company and receive that money. What we choose to do with the money is a whole other story. So that's come up a number of times. Rightfully so, that's kind of been swept under the rug because you start to look at that and it's very complex. And the system works, Monroe's happy, the county's happy, so that was pushed off. Unfortunately, that all changed in 2019. We were contacted by the state, we were issued a letter that we had to give them a timeline and a plan for how we were going to rectify that, how we would do the billing ourselves. So since that time, we've been working with Monroe. We started to have a lot of those conversations over the winter of 2019. As we got into COVID, we sidelined those as we were getting COVID, circled around that summer of 2020. So life got crazy again with COVID and testing and vaccination clinics. So we came around this again last year to start to look at that and start to work out. So we discussed many different options, going through trying to figure out, does it work for Monroe, does it work for us, is it even legal to do that? We brought in the third-party billing agency, professional ambulance billing, who Monroe deals with, to gain their expertise. We talked with New York State, we threw ideas out at them, we had an EMS attorney look at it. But we came up with basically there's only one way of doing this, where Monroe has to go out and take the call. We have to contract with the third-party billing company, who goes out and bills on our behalf, sends the money to Wyoming County, and then we pay Monroe. So that brought a number of concerns with Monroe, it brought a number of concerns with us. So a lot of conversations with the treasurer's office, the budget office, about how this cash flow will work, what's that going to do for the county, what's the expenses, how much time does that take. Monroe had those same concerns as well. So earlier this year, we had settled on a plan for how we're going to go about doing that billing. Today, and I'll focus more on that later on, but today that has not been finalized. Monroe, shortly before their contract expired in May, presented some information that with these expenses that it would cost them to do that, and they felt that they weren't able to move forward with that billing plan that we had together. So right now, we've got to rectify that, we've got to settle on how can we work this billing issue out with Monroe. Which all leads up to what our hearings today. So just a quick history on how we got here. Back in 2015, there was an EMS task force put together from the Emergency Services Office, Health Department, Hospital, as well as some representation from the Budget Office, Board of Supervisors, Ambulance, a couple volunteers from EMS agencies in Monroe. Started to look at the EMS situation, what can we do with these issues? It was identified some grant funding out there from the State Health Department, which we were semi-awarded to be able to go out and conduct a study, develop a program, and then implement the program. Where we struck out with that was we were never able to identify anyone to perform that study. So there's 3 different amounts of money that were tied to that grant. That first amount that was there was not enough for any of these companies to perform the study. So back in 2015, it was tried a few times to find someone. Circled around to that last year. Sat down with the health department, sat down with Cheryl. We had some phone calls with the state health department and the state department of state. conversations with them to see if we can still pursue that grant funding. But unfortunately, that grant funding is not over there, so we're unable to capitalize on that grant funding. So as I mentioned, in fall 2019, we received that notice from the state health department on the COVID situation. The meeting was held in December. We had over 80 in attendance there. I believe we had 10 counties represented, a couple of villages represented, the fire service. And then spring of 2022 is when a lot of things started coming together. So the first thing that happened was the contract with Monroe was set to expire at the end of May. In our contract, we have in their language where the mutual consent agreement for another 2 years with notice by the end of February. So we started those discussions with them. Essentially, you got to run around from we'll set up a meeting and talk about it, and it just never came along. May came and gone. And we came into June, continued those discussions with them. They finally agreed that they would do a short-term contract extension. We extended the contract as is, as it was, with the understanding that by this fall, some changes would be made there. Those are some of the discussions on the sides. The other thing that happened was EMS cost recovery. So this is something new that came out and just took effect on Friday, where fire departments are now able to bill for EMS services, which was never allowed in the past. The only ones that can do that were village departments. Now any fire department can do that. So that's some new legislation that came out. There were some concerns in that legislation. There's a lot going on with that. Again, that just went into effect on Friday. And there's a lot of confusion and a lot of things need to get worked out there, but I think some time to get figured out. Yeah. So we got together in December. The big point of that was to start a conversation between fire departments and elected officials, whether it's a fire district or village, whoever owns them. Have a conversation about what is going on in your department. Make sure that your elected officials are aware of the situation. And you have some of those conversations. In some places those were happening, in some places they weren't happening. And we really wanted to present some ideas on things to look at. So we presented 4 different EMS models. And we kind of pointed out some things that we felt might be worthwhile for us to further explore. Let's see how those work in Wyoming County. So we set out with a big goal of, what does a countywide system look at? If Wyoming County were to have to operate a system, what does that look like? Well, obviously, we want to know the same system as Monroe. The system Monroe is running works to a degree. Obviously, it could always get better. It's very tough in EMS. It's not a black and white industry. Call volume fluctuates on a daily basis. But having a system like Monroe is what's ideal for Wyoming County. We want to be able to adapt to change. So whether that means increasing services, making up for agencies if they're unable to handle calls, things like that. We start to look at the changes that's happened over the years. EMS is constantly changing. So we have some agencies, unfortunately not here in Wyoming County, but we've seen it throughout the state, throughout the country, where agencies close their doors. As was mentioned, agencies that lose providers that are unable to handle calls. So all those changes happen. And throughout that time, we've always worked with Monroe to adjust those resources. But we've asked them to provide more resources. We've reduced the amount of resources for a while during COVID. It's called volume down. We move those resources around where we're staged based on time to get to certain areas of county, volume, things like that. So from there, we set out with some objectives. First objective being the departments maintain their identity. The whole goal of this was set out was not to close the fire department. We want the fire departments there. Fire departments have to run first response. We will never be able to provide a system that is 100% perfect all the time. The system will always get strained. There will always be times when these resources aren't available during heavy power volumes. So it's impossible to run an EMS system. It's 100% self-supported without outside assistance. So the ability for fire departments to run first response, but more importantly, we don't want fire departments closed. We want them there. We want to be able to work with them. We want them to maintain their identity. Next is a system that allows for various financial options. So how are we going to support the system? Is it creating EMS districts? Is it charging a user fee? What is that metric that's used to bring some of that revenue in? We strive to be national standards. So there's a series of standards out there that any commercial agency is going to work for. Any cities, towns, counties that run an ambulance service are obviously striving for those same ones too. So we would want our system to try to meet to the best of our ability what those national standards are. Quality improvement is very important. You just heard Mr. Cole just talk about that at the hospital. We're constantly looking at quality improvement. Same thing. This isn't just going out taking less calls and transporting. We need to know, are we providing adequate care? Is there additional services we can provide? Medicine changes all the time. There's things are looked at in the EMS system where changes are made and protocols or services that can be run. So that's something we would want to take a look at is, you know, how can we improve the services that we're providing to, you know, the patients that are receiving that. And then mission focus, you know, what is the goal? The goal is to get an ambulance there with trained staff to meet the needs of our residents and get them to, you know, the hospital or treat them on scene, but to meet that, you know, expectation of the community we serve. So looking at all the different options throughout the state, we really circled that. We circled back to, this is where we kind of land. We really are faced with two options. We either continue with our Monroe system or we look at the county-based system. So in looking at the Monroe system, a couple of things that need to be made aware of is first the subsidy request. So today, we've never paid Monroe for their services. Monroe has gone out, they've taken their calls, they bill, what they receive, it is what it is. Over the last year, Monroe has thrown out the word subsidy a few times. Here in the last couple of months, that conversation has increased a lot. So where we sit with Monroe right now, as I mentioned, we extended the contract with the understanding that this long, we would circle back, figure out whatever it is we're doing. I've asked Monroe to give me by the end of the month a plan on, you know, what they would propose for a model in Wyoming County, number of resources, the costs associated with that, as well as a bunch of discussions, and I stressed to them we need that information right away, so that we're able to factor that in our budget plan. Monroe feels that they're unable to continue to provide a service here in Wyoming County without some sort of subsidy. That's not shocking by any means. When you look at, you know, fuel costs, when you look at the bus hospital transfers, the fact that they have done it for this long surprises me actually that they haven't. Right? We're very fortunate that they haven't for this long. But that is on the table that they will be asking. I cannot tell you what that amount is. I can't even ballpark that. I don't even know how you start to figure out what they might want. We've asked multiple times, you give us a rough idea, and we continue to get, we don't know enough to know. So I can't give you a number right now. As a need for additional resources increases, well, obviously we're going to want more money. So if we have to increase, you know, what resources are providing to us, that's going to come at a cost. Again, I don't know what that cost is. I can tell you in one area that reached out for a service for 5 days a week and 10 hours, the ballpark price they were doing was $330. So I don't know what that would factor into the grand scheme of things, but there's a number that's thrown out there. One of the questions is, you know, say we contract with Monroe, we pay them a subsidy, what if they don't provide the resources that they said they would? So in our contract extension 2 years ago, there's language in there about additional resources. So we put in there about some additional resources that they were going to top of the 24-hour units in the hospital. Unfortunately, day-to-day Monroe is unable to provide those same resources. So today we might have 2, tomorrow we might have 3, and we never know what we're going to have resources. So if we are contracting with them, we're paying them a subsidy, kind of changes the game a little bit. We're paying for a service. So how are we going to handle that if they don't provide it? Are we going to do monetary fines? And then more importantly, you know, how do we go about that? How do we prove that they're not providing what they said they're going to provide? That can be a little challenging for us. You know, with how our CAD system is, we're tracking when Monroe is in and out of service, but then you have to really dig into why are they out of service? Were they on a call, or do they not have staff? And that's where it gets very, very time consuming to go through and try to pull those numbers. Again, still no resolution on the billing issue. You know, even if you know Monroe asks for a subsidy, if we decide to give them the subsidy, whatever that is, we still have to figure out the billing issue. That is one thing that has to get figured out. And then even with all that, Monroe is still unclear on the long term, certainly, you know, providing service here in Wyoming County. So they had previously indicated that they were going to pursue a certificate of need for themselves. Their CEO and I met a couple of weeks ago for lunch, and at the time he came right out and asked if the county was running the service. I told him we were running our numbers. We had to do revenue diligence, so we had to at our numbers. And he told me that they weren't sure if they were gonna put it for CON or not, for the mere fact that there's quite a substantial cost to that. And there's a possibility that they won't be granted one. The CON process isn't the best process in the state, but it is what it is. So they would have to go out and show a need to provide a paramedic service. I personally feel, I don't know how they're gonna show a need and they're providing that need right now. But it happens throughout the state, people apply, again, that's not our decision to make, that's up to, you know, the powers to be to make that decision. So the other option is the county-based system. Again, similar style models in Monroe, where we run, you know, the services they run, and then we expand the services as needed. So you can go to the next slide, Joe. So with the county system, we started to look at our numbers. So again, we compiled a lot of that information over the last couple of years, and then we really started digging through it the last couple of months on what it is. So these are just the major startup. These are your big ticket items that you need to operate in the ambulance. Those through, you can see bottom line number, you know, 437,000. Now again, not kind of big numbers. One of the big variables in here, this is what they use the ambulances. The ambulance market nowadays is not good. 12 months ago, the brand new ambulance at 205,000. Used ambulances are out there, they're not easy to find. So this is banking on go out and find used ambulances. Looking around online, you know, what we saw, you know, potentially around 45,000, but again, with that number subject to change. Then other major items, stretchers, stair chairs, you know, some of that equipment that you're required to have, you know, significantly gets us to that 437,000. So our next expense, you know, Joe, is our annual operating expense. So we started to break down, well, what are those bigger items that you would need, or what are those, you know, ongoing expenses you would need, you know, patient care reporting, medical supplies, uniforms, maintenance, all that type of stuff that goes into running a system. So based on those projections, what we came up with is $204,000, just under $205,000 over the course of those 3 different units. So again, that's two paramedic ambulances and a fly car. So your expenses on your fly car are going to be a little bit less than your expenses on an ambulance. Now, with that said, the fly car model isn't really working today like it used to. So that would be something that we would look at changing over to an ambulance, whether that's 3 ambulances running 24 hours or 2 ambulances 24 hours, 30 ambulance, 12 hours, 16 hours. You know, that's something that we have to be decided on. There's a potential for that 24-hour ambulance. So we did run some of those numbers for the 30 ambulance just to start to see how those differences would be. Our next major expense we look at, is the salary expenses. So based on the number of employees needed, we look at a 24/7 ambulance, we need the equivalent of 8 full-time employees. So a paramedic ambulance is staffed with 1 paramedic and typically a basic for a driver. And then the paramedic fly car with 1 paramedic on there. So based on the staffing that would be needed to run that staffing model is pretty consistent to what Monroe has. What they currently run right now, or what they would target to run if they had the staffing that they need. Obviously, some variables that come into play here. So if you don't get the number of full-time employees you need, you have to hire additional part-time employees, things like that, that could, make some changes there. On the bottom, you'll see a couple different things. Is the first one, a paramedic operations manager. So who's going to oversee the state-of-the operation? Monroe right now, one of their paramedics is their operations manager for Washington County, so he handles day-to-day issues here in Washington County, and then reports whatever he needs to back to corporate office. So who's going to oversee that? That's going to be a working paramedic. They're going to be on the ambulance taking calls. They're going to handle some of those things you need that paramedic to handle. Do anyway from narcotics and equipment issues, things like that. With this side of the operation, additional administrative support. So just from the billing aspect, the credentialing aspect, the order of equipment, things like that. So we factor that in to bring in some additional administrative support to come up with our annual salary. Read on my spreadsheet, about $1.7 million. So you go to that slide, Cheryl. So next one is our overall, what are we looking at? So you can see startup costs. So again, this is the cost for the whole year. What we look at, startup costs, operating expenses, salary, So that expense coming about 2.4 million is just in our startup costs. From there, we start to go through and look at the call volume, the reimbursements, that type of thing. So in running our projections that we've run, we feel very comfortable in saying that we're becoming very close to budget neutral. There's potential where you could have a little bit of revenue come in, but there's a lot of variables that go into that. Again, what kind of patients are you going to take? What do they have for insurance? Those all pay out differently. What do the hospital transfers? Do those go up? Do those go down? That's a big piece of that. What we didn't factor in was Monroe currently contracts with both correctional facilities here, so we didn't factor any of those in. Should we decide to move forward with the EMS system, that's a state decision whether they choose to end that contract or contract with us or whatever they choose to do, so we didn't include those in. So a lot of variables that go into, when you're looking at budgeting for EMS. We've got a lot of conversations with Livingston County EMS and Karen that runs our system, and she's made very clear that it's very hard to budget for an EMS system. There's a lot of unknowns going with that. We'll just, when we look at those payer mixes and things like that, changes in fuel costs, we try to estimate a little bit high on fuel costs and things like that that we already know right now. So after year one, based on the numbers today, that's saying no changes to the system, we operate the system. 1 year later that we operate today, there's no other changes in the EMS landscape in Wyoming County, and all the numbers stay the same. It does show that that number is potentially a little bit better. Again, a lot of factors that can go into this, and we can change that, but again, we are comfortable that we could come in very close to the budget, which was the goal and set out in this. So from there, if that decision, if that decision is made to move forward, what does our implementation do? These kind of outline what are the big steps, what is our timetable for doing this. The two that quite honestly scare me the most are finding the ambulances and the staff. Even if we were to bring over all Monroe staff right now, there's still a couple staff members short, so we would still need some help there. The whole is looking at the pay scales across the region, our pay scale, our benefits package, and we could maybe recruit some of those that work for some of those other agencies outside of Wyoming County and bring them over. I know we're going to, if we do this, we're going to compete with Idaho County. We're in the process of doing the same thing. The whole plan is still people from RCMS. So we're going to be competing with that as well. We do have a number of people that work from Monroe that are not from Wyoming County. They live in places like Hamburg, Evidence, so they're driving an hour plus to get here to work. So the whole thing is we'll be able to bring those over and potentially a few more that work for maybe some of the services in the Buffalo area. So that's just kind of going through our target and how we need to get some of those big items to be able to implement that plan. So what are the issues and concerns? Again, the biggest issue, that billing issue still exists with Monroe. What's Monroe's long-term plan here in Wyoming County? What are they going to do? Are they going to pursue a CON or not? If they don't get the CON, so best case scenario, Monroe applies for the CON, they get it. It can alleviate this issue. Monroe can go out, they can take the calls, they can bill. So it takes care of that. If it doesn't take care of all this, even if they get the CON, he's indicated he's going to ask for a subsidy. So we're still going to be owing them some amount of money. Again, I don't know what that amount is. I'm hoping to have that happen by the end of the month, to bring forward. If they don't pursue a CON, then we're back to the same issue about how to bring in the billing. And we know that that's going to come at a cost. So they've already given us what they estimate their cost is going to be, and then add that on to another subsidy that they may be looking for. The other option, we could issue an RFP for services. So we could put something out there, see what else is out there available. I did reach out to RCMS, had a conversation with them yesterday. Essentially, they have the same concerns. They obviously don't have the numbers, look at the numbers. They've gone through a similar situation, they'll just Springville, dealing with CON and issues like that. They are more than happy to come in and provide a service in Wyoming County. We've been a target for them for a number of years. They're based out of Batavia. They have an operation out in Springville. We're sitting in the middle. They would love to provide it. I now think that they have a plan, a Wyoming County plan sitting on their shelf. I asked them, do you think that there would be a subsidy involved? And they did Again, they don't know what that is, without running the numbers, because there will be some sort of subsidy. So, we go ahead. So what's the uncertainties? So our estimates are based off of Livingston County's fee schedule. So the fee schedule and what is decided to bill for services is set by the Board of Supervisors. So Livingston County Board of Supervisors set their fee schedule, so we work off their fee schedule to come up with our numbers. Payer mix, how we came up with that Medicare, Medicaid breakdown was through professional ambulance billing, and that's a company that does the billing for Monroe. So they provide us with the payer mix for Wyoming County to go through and figure out those numbers. As I mentioned, the unknown call volume, the payer mix, prison calls, hospital transfers, those all impact your bottom line number. So the variations in there. Staffing, everyone knows staffing is challenging in any industry. EMS historically has always been a challenge. To recruit someone and retain someone is going to be even harder. So again, making sure that we're taking care of the staff, that we're paying them with their worth, with our benefits package, to hopefully recruit and retain them. What does EMS cost recovery legislation mean? Again, it's too early to know. There's a number of agencies that are actively looking at moving forward with billing. What does that long-term mean? It's too early to tell. And the ability to maintain budget neutral is unsustainable. Completely upfront and honest right now that there's no way that we could continue to operate an ambulance service for the rest of the time without there being a cost. The numbers earlier show you the declining volunteers. As we start to lose more agencies in Wyoming County, or if we're fortunate that we haven't yet, the county's going to be asked to pick that up. We see that happening in Livingston County already. Every year they're picking up additional areas that were previously serviced by another agency. That comes at a cost. Unfortunately, our call volume, even though it does go up a little bit, the numbers don't work out to budget neutral. Statistically, you're going to need $1,000 per ambulance. To run a service a long time with 3 ambulances will never happen. It can't happen. There's too many factors against us. We have hospital transfers, prison calls that take 2, 3, 4 hours. If you split the county in half and we're looking at the east side of the county, I'd be much more comfortable in lesser ambulances because the majority of them come back to Warsaw, you have shorter turnaround time. Into the west side of the county, your hospital distribution is all over the place. Springville, only in Warsaw, Buffalo. So again, we have those 3, 4 hour calls. And on top of that, you can't turn around to another call in the city of Buffalo. So we're looking at that model, but there's no way we can run a system with 3 ambulances. The factor in what do we do when we get that MBA at 20 and 77 of the 7 patients, that right there puts a strain on your system. So right sizing that operation would be a constant battle. Again, this is the issue Livingston County faces every year when they're preparing their budget. They don't know this year if all of a sudden an agency is going to come to them and say we're not. It happens to them, they deal with it. So we have to be able to adjust to that as things change. Next slide, Joe. So next steps. So again, I present to you guys today to give you an overview. So after this, we do have some information that it has in there a hard copy of the proposals. We'll really start to detail those out. Break down the expenses so you guys can see and review. My goal, based on the timeline we're looking at with Monroe, is to come back in September. We should, if Monroe does submit to us a proposal, and at the end of the month, we can factor that in. We can run the comparison on what they say that they can provide for what their amount is, versus what we can provide for what our amount is. Bring that back to you guys for consideration. If we choose to do that, just to throw that out there, if that decision was made in October, the goal would be to be up and running by February. One thing to consider with that is, if that decision is made, I feel we would have to come up with an amount of money to get Monroe for a stopgap for them to continue to operate from the time that decision is made until day 1 of county operation. Monroe would be up for that, but I don't know if they would do that kind of so that might be something where there's some wants to get. That's a conversation we could have. Monroe, they've done this for a long time. They're aware of what's going on out there in the state. They're aware that we're looking at our numbers. He's indicated to me twice that we should run our numbers. That anyone to come in and run the system is not gonna happen without any sort of subsidy to them. So he encouraged us to run our numbers, but they obviously have to look out for their business as well. So that conversation, when we sat down for lunch, we had a very open conversation. I told them we were running our numbers, we were gonna make a presentation to the board. No decisions have been made, it's way too early for that, but we did have to look at our numbers on what it would cost us. But we need to know something from it. I can't continue to get, I don't know why. So we need to get some hard numbers from them to make a decision on what to do. So in the packets, Sylvia and Andrew will hand those out, you guys can see those. If you have any questions, as you're going through, look at those, feel free to call. Try to answer those questions you may have, or additional questions you have. Again, as we get that information back from the role, we'll run those numbers and take a look at that. And plan on coming back here this fall to present what those numbers are with their analysis. Any questions now, or?
You base your revenue, Brian, what you base it on, number of calls. We started ours and we found, maybe you're gonna get 75% of that money.
Yeah, so we based off one of those calls, so how many calls on the road runs. So when you start to look at EMS calls, not every call is billable. There's a number of calls that happen that you can't bill for. You might get canceled on the way, it might be a patient sign off. On those patient sign offs, that's a decision that you guys as a board would have to make. Do you charge those patients or not? I don't believe Livingston County is charging for a patient sign off, some areas are charging. Motor vehicle accidents, those are kind of your easy money type things where you go with car insurance. So there's a number of calls where you're going to get canceled. 30% is a little high, so however 100 calls you take, 30 of them you're not going to be able to bill for. The number's a little bit high, but it's a good planning number to utilize. And out of that, there's a number of calls that they pay differently. So not every call is going to pay the same. So we could have our set rate, for instance, say an ALS call. You guys decided $1,000, so that's what we're going to charge for an ALS call. Well, Medicare, Medicaid are a set fee. They're going to come back and whatever they're going to pay, they're not going to pay any more. Where we get into different pay is depending on the insurance company. So that's where we have to work with the insurance company to set up an agreement to try to get to that $1,000. You may have Blue Cross Blue Shield that says $700, and Univera that says $850. Those are some of those things out there. So we try to factor those in. We broke down the figures to a percentage based on our payer mix in Wyoming County to say, this percentage we're covering as Medicare patients, this percentage of Medicaid, this percentage of self-pay to come up with those numbers.
More of a statement than a question. You want to start a new ambulance service? We got Medicaid and Mercy Medics and a bunch of other ones from the city that are doing it, trying to do it. And nobody's got a good grasp of it, and they're constantly dropping calls and losing calls or losing money. And bottom line, what you just talked about with insurance companies are out there not paying. And every time you don't cross the T, dot an I, they kick it back and kick it back and kick it back. That's a huge problem at the hospital. That's another reason why we're so far behind at the hospital. And to start off and try working with a third party, I'm very skeptical that we're going to be able to sustain a neutral, loving neutral position. I think it's going to cost us money. It's going to cost us money either way, but I hesitate to say that we're wrong.
Yeah, so that's my concern going is, we wouldn't be doing our stuff, we would contract that out, to bring in, people that don't do that stuff. Collections is another issue that has to be decided. How does the board want to handle collections, how aggressively we go after, collections. Looking at the numbers, again, we're pretty comfortable, in budget neutral. As I said, it won't always be the case. Maybe a little for 2 years, 5 years, I don't know. Because I don't know what changes are going to happen. No one knows what the changes are going to be. But as that system needs to increase, we will not be able to say budget neutral. But on the other aspect, we're going to be paying whoever to do that. Monroe, Mercy, ABC company. Looking at this, the struggle we have right now is we really don't have that control over the window operation. We ask them to provide certain resources. Sometimes they provide, sometimes they don't. If we're paying them, that changes things, but again, how do we handle, if they don't provide those resources? So if it comes down to the end of the day where we're gonna lose 100,000, I'd rather lose 100,000 running the system ourselves than giving 100,000 away. At least we can control that to our degree. We can make the changes, we can work with you guys to say, hey, we need additional resources, we can move resources around, whatever that might be, to try to reduce that down. But, I'm not gonna sit here today and say, no, we'll always make money or always be budget neutral, because that time will come that we will lose. It's just where do we want to lose that? Do we want to lose that to a system we're running ourselves? Do we want to lose that to paying someone else to do it for us?
Thank you, Brian.
You're gonna make some-
Good job.
Turn it over to.
Oh, Eric. How are you?
Woman said to me, Mr. Becker, just.
Supervisors, just, because we had another agenda item come up here, and also our county attorney would like to speak with us. Attorney-client privileges. What I'm gonna do is recess the committee of the whole, conduct our board of supervisors meeting, and then we'll reconvene at the board of supervisors. So that everybody is on here. Okay?
You're starting at 2:30.
Yeah, we're set right at 2:30.
You just, all I did was receive an email like that's the.
Yeah, but I don't have one. I have enough.
Oh, okay.
I could tell. Upset. It doesn't surprise me. I'll come to that.
I remember that.
Wait, Cindy.
One night. All over. I haven't talked. I did.